We can go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. I'm George Demiris, and I want to welcome you to today's Penn AI Tech webinar. Penn AI Tech is the Penn Artificial Intelligence and Technology Collaboratory for Healthy Aging, an initiative funded by the National Institute on Aging. And today we're honored and excited to have Dr. Deborah Estrin as our speaker. Dr. Estrin is a professor of computer science at Cornell Tech in New York City, where she holds the Robert V. Tishman Founders Chair, and she serves as the Associate Dean for Impact. She's an affiliate faculty at Weill Cornell Medicine, and her research activities include technologies for caregiving, immersive health, small data, participatory sensing, and public interest technology. Before joining Cornell University, Dr. Estrin was the founding director of the NSF Center for Embedded Network Sensing at UCLA, pioneering the development of mobile and wireless systems to collect and analyze real-time data about the physical world. Dr. Estrin co-founded the nonprofit startup OpenM Health and has served on several scientific advisory boards for early-stage mobile health startups and as an Amazon scholar. I want to remind you all that you can enter any questions you may have in the Q&A box. And after Dr. Estrin completes her talk, we will have a few minutes at the end for a discussion and to answer your questions. So with that, Dr. Estrin, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me just do the share screen bit. Sorry, Windows in the wrong place. There we go. Confirmation that that's working from somebody?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you for this invitation. It was one that I could not refuse, given how interested I am in the subject matter of your initiative, and am excited to be sharing these thoughts with you, and also for follow-up that we might do in the Q&A, or hopefully some more substantive follow-up through emails and such. So please don't hesitate to reach out. So the medical data that's fueling the development of AI and tech tools for medicine are, of course, about patients. But most are generated by clinicians. Vital signs and blood labs and radiology reports, clinical notes, and all those things that we try to model and use in predictive algorithms and such. Now, what I want to focus on in particular are opportunities and challenges of leveraging patient-generated data and newer immersive technologies for healthcare, and with a particular focus on conditions of aging and an interest in how they fit into caregiving in the home. So, as this audience knows, treatment is not just a one and done thing. So for many conditions, it's an ongoing iterative process. And that's really where patient-generated data comes into play as the treatment begins and proceeds over weeks, months, years, sometimes a lifetime. And these data power these three critical feedback loops of health: the clinical decision-making, so to adjust treatment over time, such as medication or dose; the patient or caregiver management and self-management, so to track things like symptoms and health behaviors; and then, of course, and importantly, research evidence as to what works for different types of patients. And this is particularly important when traditional clinical encounters are infrequent relative to important fluctuations in the patient's state, and when disease progression is highly individualized. So whether it's a longer-term progressive condition or an episode of care, such as post-hospitalization or treatment or rehab. This particularly relates to things like neurological conditions, musculoskeletal, and, as I said, sort of episodes of care, post-stroke, hospitalization, surgical recovery, and that applies sort of equally to orthopedic and cancer patients. And then, of course, long COVID. So it's, in other words, when one size does not fit all, nor forever. So you need this iterative adaptation. Hiroko Dodge, a gerontologist that I had the opportunity to work with for a little while from OHSU, said to me once that this all one size does not fit all is particularly relevant to older adults, because as we age, we become more and more heterogeneous. She said, you know, when you're babies, we're sort of different in terms of our genetics, but as we go through life and have done different things, been exposed to different things, we are really heterogeneous. And ever since she mentioned that to me, the concept of using, whether we call it small data or other things for older adults, has really stuck with me as sort of a foundational reason why this story is particularly important for older adults. So the story begins like well over 15 years ago, not the story of older adults, the story of using these technologies, when advanced consumer devices entered the market. So even back then, the secondary use of these otherwise sort of consumer productivity, entertainment, whatever, social related devices, the use of these things and the data they generated for personalized healthcare didn't go unnoticed. And even back then, we knew that the raw data continues to be a non-starter. Frontline clinicians and home caregivers do not have time or tools to act on the noisy minute-by-minute output of these devices. And so the concept of digital biomarkers that are computed from patient-generated data has emerged really as the bridge to drive clinical advances. In other words, across a range of clinical contexts, the technical challenge is to leverage data science, AI, ML, to make that data actionable. And we're now, I hope, at an inflection point where there are finally enough devices deployed to fuel rich data sets needed for model development and clinical validation. So I say I hope, because I certainly have been wrong on that prediction before, because some of this was true already 13 years ago. Not the degree of deployment, but the possibility, the potential of using actual products that individuals could use to inform this model of improved clinical care. And the progress has been slow, at least by technologist standards. And what I am is a technologist. And of course, we know that in part that's due to not so well aligned incentives between our healthcare system and innovations in this kind of care. Also, I think for a long time, I did not have the mindset, we as a community didn't have a mindset of solving a pain point for doctors and for providers. We were more, I was more taken with the patients, the problems I could solve for patients and families and caregivers. And also the EHRs and the smartphones and devices themselves were just insufficiently deployed back 13 years ago. And I point to 13 years ago because at that time, with a fantastic colleague, Ida Sim from UCSF, we started OpenM Health, which I won't have really time to talk about more, and wrote this science article and thought that it could be the beginning of precipitating a lot of advances in this space. And I would say not until Ida came and really wrote another paper, I'm not talking about causality, but correlated, wrote her paper in New England Journal of Medicine 2019, that marked what I think was more of an inflection point. And I want to say that now, I think we have something else going on that is a catalyst for me to have hope again that maybe this really will start to happen more. And that's the age of virtual care. Because clinicians, when they're on the other side of a virtual care session with a patient, basically this technology, are deprived of the signals they're used to having in in-person visits. And so there's an opportunity for digital biomarkers to address needs, not just nice to haves, of clinical care and of the clinicians. And so there's really a lot, I think, of unexploited, unleveraged potential at this point to operate off of what it is that the clinician is missing, when they're delivering virtual care, and to really lean in with the opportunities that we have to fill those things. So to the extent this isn't just one long narrative, a vague outline, a little bit more on patient-generated data and digital biomarkers and some examples. I'll mention digital and immersive therapeutics, and then I'll save the very end to talk a little bit about some very work in progress, early work around XR and caregiving in the home. So first, let me just step back. I gave you the summary of the whole talk already, so now let me dig in. First, I mentioned digital biomarkers. They're also in the title of the talk. And what are they? I don't even know who came up with this term. I heard it and thought it sounded like the right term. And basically, I think of a digital biomarker as being a function of that patient-generated data. Here's a formal definition up at the top. And basically, there are measurements that help describe and explain health outcomes and inform patient assessment and treatment. And it is the case that over time, digital biomarkers will undoubtedly, in some cases at least, become well understood enough and well validated and robust enough because of the large amount of data that informs the models behind them, that they might play a role in, they will play a role in some context in diagnosis. But that's, for the most part, not what I'm talking about here. Think about this not for the person, from the perspective of diagnosis, but from the perspective of that ongoing care for individuals that have been diagnosed. And so let me jump into some examples of where the patient-generated data comes from. First, I just want to lean in on what is to some extent just a modernized version of a patient survey, a patient-reported outcome, good old self-report, right? Patient-reported outcomes are not new, but with consumer technology so prevalent, we really were able to power the reminders, the time-stamped responses, right? This fundamental shift between when you get a piece of paper that might have been filled in at any time, for the month in between a clinical visit, versus when you get those time-stamped, even geolocated responses, and making it easier for patients to do these things on a regular basis because they're happening on the devices that they anyway use to operate their lives. Great early examples like Text for Baby. If you never saw it or aren't aware of it, I think it's a really important reminder of one of the most, a high impact piece that worked off of just text messaging and, if you will, a bot in the background. And then we moved on to apps, and we've moved on to conversational agents and multimodal agents. Here in the diagram is a picture of something that a former PhD student who's now a postdoc at Stanford, Andrea, worked with Memorial Sloan Kettering, clinician there, on looking at the early feasibility of doing the ERFA for older adults to assess frailty. And what's interesting about this happens to be a multimodal Alexa. What's interesting about it is the natural availability of that voice interface, but that it combines the visual as well. So visual and verbal. Pictures can address literacy. The persistence of the visual gives you something that's not as ephemeral as just some spoken question, clearly relevant to segments of older adults. And patient-reported outcomes are super important. The perception a person has of how they're doing is important, but in many contexts, it's also insufficient. You also want to combine with it not only the person's perception of their state, but also some measure of their function, of the level of the symptoms or side effects, and so forth. So I am not dismissing perception as important. This is a yes and sort of a thing. Another type of input is also to some extent a self-report, but it starts to bring in some objective measurement, right? In the same way that, the spatial memory tests and all sorts of things have been developed over many years, decades, right? As the tests that you do to assess patient function. And some of those have been translated over to the internet context first, and then over to smartphones, and smartphones had the added capability of all the sensors on the phone. And so, that Parkinson's tapping test using the surface of the phone, I'll mention that in a moment again. Balance, having somebody stand on one foot and measure their amount of movement on that one foot and the timing. And what's interesting about active tasks that were introduced many years ago by ResearchKit is it's really hard. It's certainly doable. It's harder to pull out these episodes of what somebody's doing and tell the difference between somebody standing on one foot and doing some other activity, whether it's resting their foot on a bench below their desk, as I'm doing right now. And to do these active tests, it's cheating, if you will, but it's making the task more doable. Same thing for a vocal biomarker. You can try to be privacy invasive and record their phone calls all the time, or you can select a moment in time and do a specific test around vocal biomarker. For anyone working in this space, I think that active tasks are really just an important pragmatic thing to look at leveraging. Now, of course, the holy grail for lots has been that continuously passive observation, because in the end, anything that you have to ask somebody to do, ask the patient to do, over time, if you're doing things for a long period of time, it's a hard thing to sustain. That alert fatigue that has been documented in so many contexts. So it's not that those are not relevant, but that the opportunities to make use of wearables. Let me get rid of this. I'm hoping you're not seeing this asking me about captioning. Anyway, the opportunity to make use of continuous passive monitoring, where there's not much that the individual has to do. They do have to put on their device. I'm wearing two at the moment. I have a smartwatch and I have the Oura Ring on. And I do have to remember to put it on and to charge it. And, from whether it started out on our waist with those pedometers and even the first Fitbit, right? And it moved to our wrist and our fingers and now our earbuds. And sometimes we think it will move to our glasses. In all of them, really, it's been a common suite of sensors: accelerometer, temperature, PPG, which uses an LED and a photodetector to measure blood volume variations. And what has driven it, the progress, is, and continues to drive the progress, is better and better machine learning based models to interpret that data. And there have been hundreds, maybe thousands of studies at this point about using Fitbit alone. There's just an example on this slide, and Oura Ring as well has been used in many studies. And of course, here just an example during COVID. And again, I would say, sort of like active tasks, you're studying in this space, if you're doing longitudinal work, if you're doing things with patients outside the hospital, maybe even inside the hospital, we should just be including some type of wearable in those studies, because over time we'll get better and better at building the models of being able to use them. I will just throw in for a moment that I've been using this Oura Ring, wearing an Oura Ring since I think late 2018. I own no stock in the company. I don't even know anyone who works there, although I always think it would be lovely to know anyone there. And this past summer, in about June, I was on my regular run in Central Park, and I hit the usual, what they call the Harlem Hill. I live uptown, and my heart rate started, I could feel it just pounding through my chest, which is not normal. Anyway, I went back and looked at my Oura Ring data, which I hadn't been looking at my readiness and my heart rate that specifically. I usually check my sleep quality or something. And it turned out that my heart rate had sort of a few weeks before started to do this precipitous increase, went to my doctor. Long story short, I had a rather unusual, not very common thing called subacute thyroiditis triggered by a virus that was not COVID. I had a very hot, uncomfortable summer. But when I showed my endocrinologist the data from my Oura ring when I first went to see her, she said, that went up so quickly that I think that this is going to be a case of subacute thyroiditis and not actual thyroid disease, Graves or something else, which tends to go up more gradually. The story is relevant just to say it didn't diagnose me. I needed to go to the doctor, have my thyroid checked, and all of that. It wasn't really used by my doctor, but it was used by me because every day I could see, and as I was seeing that I was getting worse and not better, it was useful for me, canceling obligations and things like that. And it was also a great relief to me when I finally saw that I was turning the corner on all of that. So across the board, and I just mentioned this in particular for wearables, but it's really true for the patient-reported outcomes when all these things come together. Where the technical challenge is to compute digital biomarkers from multimodal patient-generated data. And we sort of do that in levels, right? So I mentioned PPG. We need to take that blood volume, which is the inferred lower level value, and then we need to come up with heart rate. And then we maybe need to come up with, we infer above that, depending on what we're trying to understand. We might be trying to understand sleep quality. We might be trying to understand something in a behavioral health context, whether somebody is doing more self-isolation, generally less active. On the other hand, becoming perhaps entering a manic episode. So depending on your clinical context, we maybe are using similar low-level data and mixtures of data, but as we move up this stack, if you will, we begin to differentiate more and more to the particular clinical outcome of interest. And we need to have, we can use common devices, we can use some common lower-level ML models, but we can't reuse sort of validation studies that we really have to do within the clinical context in which we're trying to do something. So one thing I just want to emphasize is that the devices have slowed down sort of in how new they are and how different they are. And one might think that means sort of that's the end of the engineering innovation. But I think of it really as just the beginning of really driving the engineering innovation, which has to happen in the mode of the data, right? So just like CT, MRI, ultrasound, like those were around a long time, and then all of that data began to fuel all the biomedical imaging, AI applied to medical imaging, and that's really where we are now, is having enough of these devices, getting these data sets, to looking at them in the context of particular clinical needs. And this is an amazing time for looking into the innovations that are needed on the data side. So a couple of specific examples, Parkinson's, really, I think of as like the earliest really deep success to date. The condition is well matched by early sensors, things like accelerometers, and by the need for that individualized longitudinal management to adjust treatment as the condition progresses. There was an early research kit application, the mobile phone study from 2015 that I mentioned, made use of the tapping test on the phone. I like it because it started with a clinical measure that was well used, and they looked to sort of make something analogous. They validated that it was analogous. And then what's really interesting is you go, and it's like 7 years later, end of last year, there's an FDA cleared symptom monitoring app for Parkinson's. And that was thanks to all the work that was going on with mobile and other, and with ResearchKit and other things to look at the monitoring, patient and clinically relevant monitoring of Parkinson's. And it's a game changer for medication titration and symptom management for current patients. and maybe even more important for clinical trials, for new therapies, for future patients. Oh, and one more thing to add is that in the last year in particular, the great work of Dina Katabi and a larger community of people who work in the space of wireless sensing, where you're using wireless signals to detect fine resolution activity, things like just even respiration and breathing changes. And they looked at this for Parkinson's patients as a non-invasive way of measuring nocturnal breathing signals. So once we get purchase in an area where we realize this stuff is clinically really relevant and powerful, new technologies get explored as well. Another really important clinical context to measure this is also precision behavioral health. Mental health broadly is this context where these data signals are needed to drive individualized, precise, longitudinal care and research. Mental health conditions are undertreated, found late, in part due to the lack of clinical measures that really help clinicians, caregivers, and individuals themselves assess, not just from a diagnosis perspective, but also assess how they're responding to a new therapy. As we all know, mental health, behavioral health really significantly impacts the outcome and even costs of overall healthcare. And this is increasingly recognized as so important in the context of older adults and isolation, not just during the pandemic, but that was around long before. So Tanzim Chowdhury, a very close colleague of mine from Cornell Tech, is really a world leader in this space. And here's another complex view, but you can follow it up in the paper, of where you're going from these low-level sensors, raw sensor data, to these low-level features, to higher-level behaviors, up to clinical state. And this is, I think, that sort of the paradigm for how to make progress in moving these sorts of innovations into relevance for research and care. Oops. I mentioned vocal biomarkers a moment ago, and Parkinson's, I think, was one of the first places that I remember hearing about vocal biomarkers being a relevant measure for Parkinson's, maybe even as far back as the 60s. So I just wanted to put up this example of a product. This is a startup, mind you, conflict of interest. About 5 years ago, I was a very early advisor, but I'm not now. And I think it's just a really rich example of how they're using ambient measurement of vocal and of language use as well, in the context of a phone conversation with an AI agent that calls up the older adult, not out of the blue. That older adult knows that this agent calls them up and asks them for some updates on how they're doing and how they're feeling. And they both use the content of that, as well as the vocal and the language biomarkers, as measurement. And I think it's a pretty fantastic integrative story in this context. Okay, so I want to segue from straight measurement to what is called in the field digital therapeutics, where you deliver an intervention, not only doing a measurement. Now, of course, measurements by themselves, right, can be a form of intervention, but you'll see what I mean as I give you some examples. These are really interventions that are driven by software or digital devices to treat, not just monitor a condition. So why does that? It's been impressive how sort of quickly digital therapeutics have taken root, at least in the sort of startup new products community. And for a moment, I was wondering why that was. But of course, the market likes digital therapeutics because they have more scalability and bottom line impact for healthcare delivery costs. You're not just, in some sense, when all you do is bring better measurement to the doctor, to the clinician, there's a more indirect path to saving costs. And there's all kinds of issues of clinician burden and things of that sort. So digital therapeutics have been a faster uptake, I would say, because they are appealing in that way to the healthcare system bottom line. And in this context, the two really, if you will, early contexts where we've seen successful products is with behavioral health and musculoskeletal health. Again, due to the nature of those conditions. When I was really first starting to do anything related to mobile health, I had the opportunity to work with some folks at the VA Center for PTSD Research, and they were just then developing PTSD Coach, which I really think of as one of the first digital therapeutics. I think it was released in 2011, but of course, prototyping and work on it was going on even before then. And we see, and here are just some of them on this slide. There are examples of product examples that have emerged for behavioral health conditions in particular. Moving on from that sort of mobile driven in the moment ways of doing interventions, for lack of a better word, just sort of calling it immersive therapeutics that are based on extended reality, AR or VR, have been an interesting area, and in some contexts demand new technical innovation. They have taken hold in those contexts, not surprisingly, where there's really a tech to market fit, that the nature of the conditions and established treatments can see value of being able to do the home-based equivalent, leveraging these technologies. And in particular, we've seen this for augmented reality of sorts being used in the musculoskeletal space to give individuals feedback and encouragement along the rehabilitation exercise space. And on the VR side, for exposure therapy, for PTSD, for pain management, and even some for stroke rehabilitation. So, as I've mentioned a couple of times, across these sort of patient-centric developments of the last decade, patient-generated data, digital biomarkers, immersive therapeutics, the adoption was slower than I anticipated, but I also see accelerated interest and demand in the context of virtual care. And again, because this addressed the needs of clinicians, not only of their patients. And this progression in this trend is particularly interesting to me in the context of older adults, for whom the burden of frequent in-person visits is greater, and also for whom we also need to consider not only that older adult, but perhaps the caregiving network that they hopefully have around them in the form of caregivers, informal family members or formal. So I want to sort of mention a few things at the close of this part, this sort of digital biomarkers, digital therapeutics, before I go into my pet research project, and say that if you're working in this area, for all of us who are working in this area, it's really a different story than it was a decade ago or 15 years ago for sure. There's no need to start from scratch. There's a really rich digital health ecosystem with platforms and standards. And for many contexts, you want to go out there and use a product that somebody else has developed and integrate it into your research and explore how it's working and what contexts, apply it to a different context, augment it with additional technology, and so forth. So here's just a sampling of some of those places that I think really make a great start. There's also another comment I want to make in terms of wrapping that piece of it, which is that it's just not okay to not mention that the governance challenges still remain. We have more standards than we had in the past, and that's good. there's good progress that's enabling patient data access and sharing. Can really, in a very different way, grab your data. You or your caregiver can carry it around on your phone or your iPad and bring it to another doctor. That really has happened and changed very much over the past decade. On the other hand, the ease of all that data flow raises questions of transparency and accountability. We just saw this with the pharmaceutical startup, which is actually being fined for sharing data with advertisers. And it's just not enough to say caveat emptor, and it's up to the consumer to check that they're giving permissions to the right set of things. When you're seeking healthcare for you or a family member, the last thing you do in detail is read those very long permissions. And if the answer is I get to either try to use this app that might be of help or not, I just do it because the salience of the clinical context is so much higher. So really interesting work to do, great places to start, clear policy things that we all have a responsibility to lean in on. So for the last part of my talk, this is all just newer context. The context isn't new, right? Which is that when we think about healthcare and healthcare for older adults, that often involves, or hopefully involves, some amount of caregiving in the home. And I definitely am interested in building towards a future where that caregiving in the home can be human, where the last meter is still human, whether it's a family member that occasionally steps in, whether it's a community health worker, whether it's a paid home health aide, whether it's a spouse or a partner. And it's interesting to intentionally think about the design space when you're designing for that dyad, for the patient and a caregiver, the patient and a set of people who are involved in their care. And now we're seeing shorter hospital stays. We're seeing 0 hospital stays with more and more things that are being done as outpatient, same day, go in, have the procedure, and you're back at home with a large list of instructions for the patient or their caregiver. And we are well beyond, that comfortable reliance on the sheet of paper or even the web portal that might be given to us. And I think it's a very interesting and important design context to explore how might we bring technologies to bear on that those intense periods of time when there's a lot of physical caregiving needed in the home, and caregiving tasks that the caregiver is not at all routinized to when, for example, on discharge or as somebody's undergoing cancer treatment and so forth. So that's the context for this sort of farther out technical vision. I work on this with a bunch of colleagues, and the idea, the setting is sort of you have a local caregiver, and that is not a virtual reality thing that they can't see through. Those are just some kind of a smart optical see-through AR context. And they can often just need some initial direction, might be synchronous, might be asynchronous over time as they go through the process of doing these relatively new caregiving tasks. When you have a chronic disease that's continuing over years, it's the same procedure, whether it's giving insulin or doing some exercises that are similar to what the patient needed to do 6 months ago, things become very routine. But so many episodes of acute care, the patient comes home with new needs, and that's the context in which I think this exploration of AR in particular applied to physical tasks is of most interest. So the context of asynchronous in particular, where the caregiver is able to access information, able to collect information, have that be evaluated by somebody clinically, either sort of as an augmentation to PROs, if you will, or because something more acute is happening, or because somebody is just for the first time, they're needing to do an edema test and they want to make sure that they're doing it in the right place. This is a mannequin, of course, but this is perhaps a patient with that's been diagnosed with heart failure. They had to be admitted to the hospital maybe 6 months ago, and this is a new caregiver that needs context again on whether this edema that they're observing is problematic, or they think it's not problematic, and so forth. So here you just have a little demo video of the opportunity, not just in this case the caregivers using a HoloLens, not just to be able to capture their point of view, to capture snapshots and share it with a clinical expert, but also to recall previous images of what that edema looked like 6 months ago, or what that cellulitis, infection looked like 3 weeks ago. In the top example, which is just somebody's paper that I borrowed to illustrate. So we're in early days of building, prototyping, in particular, these AR-based observational capabilities, and the sort of more magical properties, if you will, of being able to really record and replay and compare. And of course, it's an interesting challenge technically and from a design perspective, because to some extent the products like HoloLens, way too bulky for everyday use, but it's a good portent of what is possible. And the software that comes with them, they're pretty good out of the box to start experimenting. And then what's interesting about this space for computer scientists and information scientists and technologists, in addition to people who are looking to bring technology into care, is there are many questions on the interaction design of what those interfaces need to look like as I'm looking at something at the patient in the real world, and I want to refer to something that was from prior. Technical challenges about actually making augmented reality work in the wild. How do I have those prior images actually register on the patient's arm or leg to make that really valuable, to compare the prior to the current? Many things that are well beyond the current capabilities of augmented reality systems. So hoping to close and be able to take time for questions, I just want to sort of draw the talk together again, since it was sort of 2/3 about patient-generated data, digital biomarkers, and digital therapeutics, and then a little excursion into what some future tools might look like. And I really love this quote of Atul Gawande's, which is, I just want to read for you, that the more capacity we develop to monitor the body and the brain for signs of future breakdown and to correct course along the way, the greater the difference healthcare can make in people's lives, as well as in reducing future costs. And I just sort of, ever since I heard Gawande make these remarks and read this I really hold this as sort of, that's the North Star. So I just want to emphasize that what makes this a particularly interesting time for digital health is not just the broad adoption of the devices by consumers, but also the broad adoption by clinicians of virtual care. And that virtual care gives us, if you will, the lamppost under which to look for where clinicians need more signal. And digital biomarkers and therapeutics can hopefully address the growing clinical need by increasing what is observable and even actionable at a distance. And what we do for today's virtual care will also hopefully be able to enable some of tomorrow's hospital at home. And as we do more, the rich data sets will drive advanced modeling, advances in the modeling to extract the measurements we need from noisy, multimodal, and longitudinal patient-generated data. And so with that, I will workflows and be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for this really inspiring talk. I want to remind our audience that you can put your questions in the Q&A box. So before we get started, I think we already have some questions. I wanted to ask you in terms of the patient-generated health data. And as you mentioned, we have now a plethora of wearables, passive sensing opportunities, and so forth. And a lot of times there is a concern in the clinical world in terms of, would this data belong in the electronic health record? Should they be there? And who would train the clinicians to deal with this additional burden of having to look at the data? And I was wondering if you had thoughts to share in terms of what do you see the intersection between patient-generated health data and EHR data?
Certainly. So first of all, I'm glad that that clinical practice is wary. I'm glad they're careful, and that's all healthy. And I certainly recognize that just throwing more data at clinicians outside of the EHR is like, you do that as you're doing research, but that's a non-starter from a perspective of workflow. And so what belongs in the EHR? So raw data does not belong in the EHR. Digital biomarkers, once they have had clinical studies and shown how to use them, those belong in the EHR along with your lab reports. So I just think of these things as pretty analogous to lab reports. Some of them would be something that comes in and is relevant to some kind of a coding or something that might be more related to social determinants of health. Some of them might come in a coding that's relevant to the exposome. And some of them are going to come in those actual, tight clinical titration loops that determine, when you start to increase someone's dose of medication or when you see something's not being effective. So there isn't one answer for all things clinical. But first of all, we have to explore the utility. And then we have to show the utility. We have to understand in what context clinically, and otherwise these things don't work. And then they deserve to be in the EHR when they're actually coming in to clinical care. Now, another way to do larger studies, right? Not every study is the same. You do early, smaller exploratory ones where they're really, you're recruiting subjects. It's not in the context of regular clinical care, but then you move to larger studies that are in the context of clinical care. And as you move to that study, you need to do something to get that coming into the EHR for the purpose of that study, or it's just not going to be a feasible, scalable one.
Thank you. One question from our audience, an audience member who loved your talk and wants to know, as far as wearables, companies monetize their data as their primary revenue structure. So there are very few APIs available to startups that want to aggregate data and perform analysis. How should a company innovate when data is held in walled-off gardens?
So that's interesting. I wasn't expecting the first clause of the last sentence. So you're asking, how should a company innovate, not how should a researcher innovate? Yeah. If only the world were just like, I started out my career in internet protocol development. And when I say internet, I don't mean the social media, and even this was pre-web, right? Multicast routing and TCP, all those things. And that, because it was government driven, and nobody realized how much, it was before the dollar signs started showing up in the context of this. So there was a lot of open, standardized development. So if only. I think large NIH centers and initiatives, sorry to put this back on you, but I think there's a real opportunity for government funded initiatives to help lead here and to help bring in context individuals in which you do have more data to participate in this larger study, right? We're not going to prove your devices. Part of it is making data, making data available, making models available. So this is hard. It's unfortunate, and I think that those of us doing larger initiatives, we have an opportunity to float all the boats higher and help to promote innovation. I will also say, though, that like for decades earlier in my career, nobody believed in open source. Like they thought of it as somehow being anti-capitalism or something like that, right? But open source has driven a whole bunch of industry advancement. And I think that some of that same thing can apply to models that are more open. I included a reference on the slide to Tanzim's work and Dan Adler, a senior PhD student of hers. And there's quite a bit of movement. And that's also the part of academia, to try to move things forward that float boats higher and help to improve the innovation ecosystem. But yeah, it's a tough thing for new entrants. And that in the end reduces the amount of innovation we do.
Another question in our Q&A box: how and when do you recommend introducing user design principles to model our tool development?
I am not an HCI or an IS person myself, but some of my best friends and many of my best colleagues are. And so it's not one thing, right? Human-centered isn't just one thing. So I think it comes in from the very beginning, but you're bringing a different lens to it. So for example, take this, this wonky XR stuff that we're playing with now, right? So you can get all caught up in going off and doing usability studies with the current state of this technology. It's too early to do usability studies. This technology of the state of AR, we know that there are so many rough edges. So in where we are is starting to explore these preparing demo and elicitation videos to hear from experts on on caregiver education, for example. Where do they find the greatest need in really being able to teach caregivers around physical tasks? That is a form of human-centered. And first, I want to talk to experts who have worked at that front line of giving advice and training to caregivers in the home. And then I wanted to go ahead and talk to caregivers in the home. Once you find the context in which these tasks most need help, and then you start to use that to guide where you want to do your technology development. And then, of course, along the way, you're iterating with actual usability and getting input, first in the lab, and then later in actual settings. So I see it as a very staged, long process, and the answer is everywhere at each stage, but you do it differently at different stages.
I wanted to also follow up in terms of informed consent. So one of the challenges when designing technologies for older adults is that in some cases they may have limited digital literacy and not be as familiar with terms that we use when it comes to data and security. And I was wondering what your thoughts are around how can we ensure, whether it's researchers or developers, that the systems we deploy are not only accessible to people, but people fully understand the risks and the benefits for what they're signing up for.
Right. There's a wonderful, another senior PhD student at Cornell Tech, Emily Tsang, who's really looking deeply at this question of consent and the role of researchers. And in that process, it's not in an older adult population, but it is in a vulnerable population of victims of intimate partner violence, and has done and has published some really interesting work that I think also has carryover. First of all, there is no such thing as completely understanding, sorry, I'm playing with your words, either the benefits or the risks associated with these things. But we are, we must do our best and explain them to the best that we understand them. When you have an older adult and a caregiver, right? That is, you might call that cheating, but I think that that's clearly a very important and a different situation that can give you more latitude in that context. There's the same way we use visual technologies representing consent and implications visually. This was another great innovation from ResearchKit, Apple's ResearchKit, is they introduced e-consent in a very graphical way. I encourage people to look back at that. I'm sure there's further adaptation that needs to be done when you're thinking about older adults and older adults who are less fluent and don't use the technology as much in their everyday life. So I think there are some quite good examples in the direction of what's happened with e-consent. The ResearchKit example also gives you an example of where they tried to test understanding. And that's probably a bit of a luxury in the context of clinical care as opposed to research, but probably something that we could try to achieve something similar on the research side.
Great. I know we have too many questions. Maybe we'll take one more since we're almost running out of time. Have you come across any significant strategies that showed promise with patient-generated data that ended up failing?
Oh, there are many more failures than than successes here. And why they failed is, I think, a varied story. So high level, I would say that some of the work around behavior change, some of it has worked, and maybe less pervasively and consistently than we would have hoped. So if you think about wearables to try to encourage activity, even people doing things like taking pictures of their food to try and encourage healthy eating. I think when it comes to those core healthy behaviors, the environmental influences and the range of things that cause us to do unhealthy things and to not do healthy things are so much more powerful than a wearable. And so much in that space, I would say, I tried to do things there as well. It just seemed so important and have so much promise, and we didn't do it.
Well, Dr. Estern, I really want to thank you again for this wonderful talk and for joining us today at our webinar. I remind folks that our next monthly webinar will be on March 2nd with Dr. Gleason from Johns Hopkins University. And again, I want to thank everybody for attending. Have a good day.
Thank you very much.